Robert Kilburn, professor eventually at Yale University in classics and Shakespeare, wrote this in his book. It's a rather small book, but it's influential. It is certain that he, Shakespeare, nowhere alludes to any characters or episodes of Greek drama, that they extended no influence whatsoever on his concept of mythology. His opinion on this was challenged by Churton Collins, among others, but seemed to be the prevailing opinion in the years ahead. By mid-century, J.A.K. Thompson pretty much echoes that, suggests Plutarch was the source for Shakespeare. And then toward the end of the century, Michel and Charles Martindale, in their Shakespeare and the Uses of Antiquity, kind of confirmed the general opinion that any Greek language Shakespeare had would not have been sufficient to allow him to read the extremely taxing poetry of the mid-5th century BC. Moreover, despite all efforts, no one has succeeded in producing one single piece of evidence of the plays to make any such debt certain or even particularly likely. Wow. Michael Silk writing, 15 years later, there is no reason to suppose that Shakespeare ever encountered any of the Greek tragedians, either in the original or otherwise. Now, there's no Latin translations, which were the bulk of those literary translations that were continental in origin. And A.D. Nuttall, the author of Shakespeare and the thinker in Shakespeare in the Class, in his chapter there, says Shakespeare was cut off from Greek poetry. Probably a bleak truth that we should accept. And then he lists, appears in Colin Burrow, a very respected Oxford Don. In his wonderful book, really otherwise, Shakespeare Classical Antiquity, says Shakespeare almost certainly never read Sophocles or Euripides, let alone a much more difficult Aeschylus in Greek, and yet he managed to write tragedies which invite comparison with these authors. Laurie McGuire, a much more honest Oxford scholar, writing in Shakespeare's name, says, yet critics, with embarrassment, with apology, with a submerged sense of inconvenience, repeatedly note Hellenic dramatic influence in Shakespeare, an influence they are obliged to classify as an affinity. Consanguinity is another word you see to describe this connection. Finally, I get to my hero, Tanya Pollard. Even the recurring wistful musings of Shakespeare's affinity to the Greeks have typically conceded a lack of historic grounding in this apparent kinship. Yet, scholars have begun to identify specific links, and she is the avatar of this movement. Her book, I will be speaking about Greek tragic women on Shakespearean stages, is Roland Bainton award-winning book from 2018. Now, what about the previous era? Now, there's no question that contemporaneous poet-playwrights, Thomas Gough and Thomas Heywood, wrote Orestean dramas that suggested that they were keying off Hamlet, that they saw Hamlet as an Orestean drama. They recognized that they used cento kind of constructions that mirrored Hamlet in an Oresteia. So they knew the writer of Hamlet was thinking about the Oresteia and mimicking it in some ways. Producing literature based on as a palimpsest, showing other layers within it. Well, in 1780s, Elizabeth Farren played Hermione in The Winter's Tale. And this is a portrait of her by Joseph Zoffani. I think it's dated 1788 or something like that. This shows her leaning on a pedestal that shows these scenes from the Alcestis, where in the lower world, you see in the lower part of that bas-relief is Hercules wrestling with death to free Alcestis and then delivering Alcestis to Admetus, her husband, in the upper panel. So the dramaturgs, the writers, the director, whoever was interested in the Winter's Tale in the 18th century knew that the source was the Alcestis, where Hercules does rescue the presumed dead queen and brings her back as a veiled mystery woman and delivers her to Admetus and then unveils her, and then that concludes the play. It's so much like The Winter's Tale. Churton Collins was one of the great thinkers of the early turn of the century, and he suggests that really Shakespeare's dramatic art recalls character equally striking and predominating in the dramatic art of Sophocles, and he cites numerous allusions that suggest Shakespeare really knew the many dramas of Sophocles, including the Ajax and the Hecuba as sources for a variety of plays. He was really a leader in this, but Gilbert Murray's article, which changed my life, Hamlet and Orestes, Study in Traditional Types, it really suggested the connection must be somewhere, but he couldn't figure it out. He thought maybe it was some kind of archetypal transmission between the great playwrights of different era. He speculates that way. Jan Kott hits the nail on the head when he says a great deal has been written about Hamlet's connection to ancient tragedy. It is significant that the subject has been treated least by Shakespearean scholars, that historians and non-Shakespearean academics are interested in this, and lawyers. So I want to review two books briefly for you, very recent productions. One is Jonathan Bate's How Classics Made Shakespeare and Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages. Forgive me for this death by PowerPoint, the next 10 minutes here while we race through this little review for you. So I wanted to show you how the conversation is going in the most recent literature regarding the question of Greek sources within Shakespeare and the dramatic differences between a person like Jonathan Bate, who defends the traditional view of not even mentioning this thing, and Tanya Pollard, who digs down deep into it. She's a professor at Brooklyn College in New York. Bates' cover shows the Titian portrait of Venus and Adonis without Adonis's cap that is on the cover of Great Oxford and other images that many Oxfordians are aware of, and which gets referenced in the poem itself. So it's kind of an intentional deletion on the cover. It's curious, I think. In any case, his argument is solid in so many ways, and I want to show you how he goes over the top of it too. Because his book, Shakespeare and Ovid, is a very, very fine book. Shakespeare's supreme valuation of the force of imagination was honed by the classical tradition and designed as a defense of poetry and theater in a hostile world of emergent Puritanism. Can't argue with that. His memory, knowledge, and skillfulness were honed by classical ways of thinking, the art of rhetoric. If you look at the number of figures Shakespeare uses, it's pretty phenomenal. The recourse to mythological exemplars, which is one of our interests in this talk, the desire to improvise within the constraints of literary genre, the ethical and patriotic imperatives, the consciousness of the economy of artistic patronage, whatever that means, the love of debate and delight in images. Yes, 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 and yes. Terence, now he begins to go in certain directions here. Terence introduced him to comedy and scenic structure, Virgil to the heroic idiom, Horace to lyrical, occasional and satirical poetry, and Tully, Cicero, to thoughtful reflection upon ethics, politics, and public duty. These classical authors, together with the more dangerous figure of Ovid, were formative to his thinking. Yes, again. Now, here's the beginning, where he's about to go off the rails. Before he read Plutarch, he read Ovid, the author of whose work he found the things that made him a poet and a dramatist: magic, myth, metamorphosis, rendered with playfulness, verbal dexterity, and generic promiscuity. Ovidian's strangeness and wonder weave a golden thread that runs all the way through his career. Ovid was the master who taught Shakespeare that what makes great literary art is extreme human passion. Further, and then is usually supposed Horatian, sometimes Ciceronian, occasionally Tacitian, an interesting mix of Senecan and anti-Senecan, and I suggest strikingly anti-Virgilian insofar as Virgilian meant epic or heroic. Okay. What are the problems with Bates' analysis? Well, he grossly overstates the Latin text that would have been available in the Stratford Grammar School, including Terence, Virgil, Plautus, Horace, Cicero, Ovid, and Mantuan. There are inventories that do exist that have been published, show that there's really inconsistent connection to various Latin texts in these inventories we have for various grammar schools. Now, the very popular grammar schools did have really good collections, but not all of them did. And if you look at the inventories, it really challenges this assumption. Now, here he goes. Ovid's Metamorphoses was a schoolboy's book. Now, that's clearly not something, they didn't all have copies they took home with them from school, and not all grammar schools had Metamorphoses, Golding's translation. The dramatization of scenes from classical myth and history was a common schoolroom task. Where does he get this? Well, yes, I mean, St. Paul's boys, Oxford's boys performing this, but I'm not so certain that this was a common feature of the Stratford King's Grammar School. No mention of the Earl of Oxford was in the entire text. There's no mention of the Earl of Oxford, despite extensive references from Putnam, Webb, and Mears, as well as mentioning a variety of other playwrights and poets. He does not mention the name Thomas Underdown as the translator of Heliodorus's Aethiopica in 1569, nor does he mention the dedicatee as the Earl of Oxford in discussion of his multi-page importance of the Aethiopica in the development of English theater. So he assumes we all know. We don't need to know the translator or the person it was dedicated to or its date that much. There's no mention of Henry Howard, was the Earl of Surrey, who was known as the father of English sonnet, who mentions quite a bit that he was Oxford's paternal uncle, although he did die before Oxford was born. Surrey translated 2 books of Virgil's Aeneid in blank verse, and also translated Horace's Ode to Licinius, which was published in Toddle's Miscellany, which was quite popular as a source, a literary source. No explanation of his repeated statements about Richard Roe's Shakespeare's Guide to Italy as allegedly error-ridden. He makes 2 references that it's called so-called error-ridden without ever correcting one of the errors. There's a complete absence of any reference to the influence of Greek drama in Shakespeare, despite his having actually published an article published in Japan on the importance of Euripides' Alcestis in Much Ado About Nothing, which I cite in my article on that same play. Now, here we are, and forgive me for putting in too much text of Tanya Pollard. She's a wonderful scholar. She is a Yale graduate, went as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, got a master's, and then came back to Yale for a PhD, and been teaching and publishing since. And her book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, is a revolutionary piece of scholarship. And the monumental indices that she assembles on Greek editions that were published on the continent, and the various arguments she makes from the book are outstanding. I have my reasons for saying this. They'll become obvious at the end of this talk, but nonetheless, I think this is a mind-opening argument that she makes. Now, she starts at the beginning and says, okay, and this is a critique of Greenblatt, the lack of attention to Greek sources resulted in a new historicist tendency to prioritize the new at the expense of the old. She mentions all these scholars that were proponents of Greek education in the English system, and of course there are many common, many recognizable names here. Elizabeth, incidentally, translated one of the Iphigenia plays. We're not sure which one, under the guidance of Roger Hosham. So she was actually literate in Greek. No wonder the stage productions would want to reflect Greek elements. It would be so pleasing to the Queen to recognize this stuff. Of course, Oxford's tutors, Sir Thomas Smith and William Camden, who was the headmaster at Winchester, and Ben Jonson's tutor. George Buchanan, a very important character who did a Latin translation of the Alcestis, published by Henri Estienne in the mid-1550s in Paris. It's probably the source for Shakespeare's use of the Alcestis and the Antigone for other plays of Shakespeare. And so there are a lot of people here that you would recognize, very, very important people. Now, the Greek was taught in some of the very elite grammar schools, Eton, Winchester, St. Paul's, Westminster, others did have evidence of having Greek texts available to them. So there was some evidence of Greek education, although we would not probably be able to include, the grammar school in Stratford as to be considered a place where Greek was taught. Interestingly, she also mentions, this is Tanya Pollard again, in 1570, so right in the middle of all this, Pembroke College, Cambridge, established 7 Greek scholarships for merchant tailors' boys who competed. Yes, Mulcaster's boys at St. Paul's were examined in Greek for entry to St. John's College, Oxford. The ability to read Greek plays then would certainly not have been limited to those with university education, not to a small handful of elite schools. Okay, so now what about the university wits? All of them virtually had Greek literacy. Some of them have been put forward as co-authors to Shakespeare's works. So you're looking at the new deconstructionist view of Shakespeare's being represented in this case in our discussion by George Peele. Tragic Women. Professor Pollard posits that the George Peele is recognizably the co-author of the first act of Titus Andronicus, and that maybe part of Act 5 as well, based on stylometric criteria, that there were certain usages and commonalities of George Peele's style, which is admittedly a limited number of plays that were published under his name. And this would not, of course, allow Shakespeare, whoever he was, to mimic George Peele, perhaps his style, because he was a classic author. He wrote some interesting things. He translated Iphigenia at Aulis and an Apuleian, A Tale of Troy, which is kind of a long poem, not exactly epic, but a long poem. And then he wrote a comedy, The Arraignment of Paris, in 1581. So early on, he was involved in writing some poems, long poems and plays that were connected to the Greek sources. And she says that through his use, and because of his connection to Peele, where he was introduced to the Greek canon, through his use of Greek tragic icon, Shakespeare presents himself as heir to the Greek tragic tradition. Yes, he is heir. Despite the near invisibility in English literary scholarship, the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes were something of a phenomenon in 16th century continental Europe. By 1600, there were at least over 200 editions of these authors in Europe, most of which were in Latin, of course, but 28 were in vernacular European languages. None of the plays of Aeschylus, for instance, were translated to English until like the 18th century. These were like the editions that you could see from European edition. This would be the Hecuba of Euripides. On the left is the Greek text, on the right you have the Latin text. These editions included dedicatory epistles. They were scholarly editions. These were not like quarto editions. This was usually included in a folio with other plays and these translations. There would be scholarly commentaries, treatises in the genre. Mostly these, again, were in Latin. And the publishing houses in Paris and in Switzerland and in Venice where most of these plays were being published. The Greek literary treatises employed an explicitly Greek vocabulary, including tragedy, comedy, chorus, prologue, epilogue, protasis, epistasis, catastrophe, analyzing dramatic genres and their conventions, frequently printing these key terms in actual Greek letters and self-consciously attending to their etymologies. In England, there were some plays that were translated and actually printed. The Trojan Women of Euripides, a Greek edition, was published, so the Knights of Aristophanes, then English translations, Iphigenia at Aulis, and then at Jocasta, which was performed at Gray's Inn in 1566, translated by George Gaskin and Kimmelhurst. And then you had a Latin translation of the Antigone by Thomas Watson, published in 1581. I believe it was also performed at Cambridge University or Oxford University. She goes on to say this. We're almost to the end of this line of the argument. Thanks for staying with me. I'm not even looking at the clock. Euripides' Phoenician women. So that's the source of Jocasta. So Jocasta is the protagonist, Oedipus's wife. Draws self-consciously on an intertextual web of previous plays and poems about Thebes' tragic past, including, so you're saying Euripides is borrowing from Aeschylus's Seven Against Thebes, Sophocles' Antigone and Oedipus the King, and Euripides' own Sophoclean women. Antigone's viewing the soldiers from the Theban walls echoes Helen's viewing of the soldiers from Troy's walls in the Iliad. The technique is called a tychoscopia, according to A.D. Nuttall. And of course, that is a scene from Troilus and Cressida. Finally, ancient Greek plays exerted a powerful, and now we know, uncharted influence on the 16th century English dramatic landscape, identified with the origins of theatrical performance and represented especially by passionate female figures. These newly visible Greek plays challenged early modern writers to reimagine the effective possibilities of tragedy, comedy, and the emerging hybrid genre of tragic comedy. Now, she really goes into the importance of Hecuba in terms of Shakespeare's appreciation for the suffering of Hecuba, and particularly referencing Euripides' play Hecuba. That the Spanish tragedy, and then Titus Andronicus in particular, shows evidence of being influenced by the Hecuba. And Emrys Jones wrote about 10 pages just on that comparison in his book from the 1970s, I think, is when he published his book. She goes on to say that both plays link bereaved mothers with sacrificial daughters, with Greek tragic female icons, giving them a privileged authority for transferring sympathies. And the character in Titus Andronicus, the female character, Tamara, of course, is based on a character that's responsible for the death of Cyrus at the end of the first book of the histories. Herodotus, which we know the Earl of Oxford owned also and had read. So we're layering Roman literary models on Greek ghosts to form new English originals. The plays, palimpsest, she used that word beautifully, reveal crucial debts to unfamiliar origins. That is to say, the people who have not been looking at the Greeks. So Hecuba 16 times in the plays, Shakespeare forcefully revised Hecuba's prevailing literary legacy, making her specifically in Euripides' powerful and darkly triumphant image. That is, to the successful, vengeful female who blinds Polymnestor and kills his son for the sin of having killed her son Polydorus, the last of her children at the end of the Trojan War. The Hecuba and the model of tragedy that she embodies form as haunting a presence to Shakespeare as the ghost of Hamlet. In contrast to satiric playwrights such as Ben Jonson, Thomas Middleton, and John Marston, whose comedies typically featured male protagonists seeking revenge and usurpation, Shakespeare developed his distinctive hybrid version of comedy in conversation with a Greek dramatic model that emphasized moving audiences through the performance of female passions. Plays such as the Comedy of Errors, Twelfth Night depart from the Plotine models with Greek-inflected settings and allusions to Greek prose fictions, lamenting female figures. In Much Ado About Nothing, Pericles, and The Winter's Tale, suffering female figures evoke Alcestis by reviving triumphantly after apparent death, drawing on self-consciously Greek female institutions such as the Delphic Oracle and the Temple of Diana at Ephesus, which is, of course, the final scene in Pericles. Imogen, Hermione, Hero, Thaisa, Juliet, Viola, all these characters thought to have been dead, all these female characters within Shakespeare thought to have been dead and then being restored in the romances and comedies. It's a marvelous, consistent theme. Euripides' contemporary, Aristophanes, parodied Euripidean figures in his comedies, offering later playwrights such as Ben Jonson a model for simultaneously mocking and profiting from their theatrical power. Later Greek prose fictions, such as Heliodorus' Aethiopia, dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, exceptionally popular in the early modern period, not only imitated Euripidean figures and plots, but also quoted his heroines verbatim. That is to say, the literary web the Greeks were weaving is something that Shakespeare indulged just as effectively and wonderfully. Proponents of the Earl of Oxford as author of the Shakespeare plays, this is a direct quote from her book, from Tanya's book, have combed through Greek references to support claims that the plays were written by an educated aristocrat rather than the glove maker's son from Stratford. In perhaps the most exhaustive study of the Greek echoes of The Winter's Tale, Earl Showerman argued that its detailed engagement with Greek identities identifies the play's author as the Earl of Oxford. Here's the qualifier, although his argument hinges partly on inaccurate claims about the circulation of Euripides' translations in early modern England. Now, finally, in the last couple minutes here, briefly, the Earl of Oxford's cred, Greek cred. Now, Louis B. Wright, while he was the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in a book which is about Burleigh's precepts. So in the introduction, he says this about Burleigh's educating his charges, his wards. The regimen prescribed by Burleigh for the young men was strict and included not only French, Latin, cosmology, writing, drawing, exercises with a pen, and dancing, but the reading of the epistles and gospel before dinner in English and after dinner in Greek. So the young men were trained in at least reading the biblical Greek. Now, what about Oxford's direct connection to Greek literature? We know he bought an Amiot translation of Plutarch, the French translation. We have his personal Boiardo Italian translation, Herodotus, now in possession of Ben August. we evidently purchased a Plato at the age of 19 in folio, not knowing the translation, probably a Latin. He received the dedication for the 1569 edition of Heliodorus' Ethiopica by Underdown. The Greek Bible readings, of course, that Cecil House just mentioned. He attended the Greek church in Venice, and during his travels, he was accompanied by Nathaniel Baxter, who was a Greek tutor of Sir Philip Sidney, and of course, he lived in the residence of Sir Thomas Smith for an unknown period of time, and of course at Cecil House as well, which had lots of Greek literature. Here's the Greek editions that Smith owned. On so many of these were either original Greek or in translation, but virtually all the Greek canon is included there. I don't see Aeschylus, but we do know that the Cecil House Library had that. But there you have it: Aristophanes, Sophocles, Euripides, Plutarch, Plato, Lucian, all these incredible sources, Aristotle. So it's amazing the culture that the Earl of Oxford grew into because of its dedication and interest in Greek literature, the Greek canon. We know that Mildred Cecil dedicated Greek volumes to Eton and other grammar schools, elite grammar schools. We have inventories of her library, which included Greek editions. She was known as being as competent at Greek. Buchanan wrote her a Greek poem one time, said she was as competent in Greek as she was in English. So there was a deep connection across a number of webs that the Earl of Oxford was surrounded by. Those 21st century commentators all ignore, deny the influence of ancient Greek drama on Shakespeare, regrettably so. Tanya Pollard is the first modern Greek scholar in the past century to systematically examine the influence of Euripides' dramas on Shakespeare. She does not address the question of Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Aristophanes. I have written to her and we have corresponded. It's been about a year since we've written, but I did send her my paper on Macbeth, and she does have a graduate student working on the question of Clytemnestra's connection to Lady Macbeth. The articles I've written go back to 2004, Hamlet and Orestes. A lot of that is about Gilbert Murray's arguments primarily. Timon of Athens, that was inspired by a talk by Charles Beauclerk, published some years later. And Timon of Athens has remarkable parallels to Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles, and A.D. Nuttall gives a wonderful argument about that without ever admitting that there seemed to be a direct influence. And of course, Sophocles' play was not translated to English during Shakespeare's lifetime, or during the time that plays were being published. And then the Macbeth paper that really came out of my experience of being in class at the right time, at the right place. And then the Much Ado article, which I think is fairly original, specifically looking at the issues of Hercules. And besides Much Ado and Winter's Tale as sources for Shakespeare's final scenes, in those plays of the Alcestis, it alluded to in Hamlet, where by the grave of Ophelia, Hamlet says, let Hercules do what he may, the cat will mew and the dog will have his day. And this is a really weird line in the middle of his argument with Laertes, right next to the grave. But what he's referring to is that Hercules, he's not Hercules. He can't bring her back from the dead like Hercules brought Alcestis back. And the dog will mew and the cat will mew and the dog will have a day's reference to the first and 12th labors, the taming of the capture and killing of the Nemean lion, and then the capture of Cerberus. At the end, the dog will have his day. He'll get back to Hades. A summary of my articles was in 2015 in the art. It's a good place to start. It's a simple place. It kind of reviews those articles and points out the important parallels that might be worth noting. And then I did write an article early on recognizing that Shakespeare seems to have taken so many of the characters that are relatively small characters. Many of his plays, it pulls them right out of Plutarch. He knew Plutarch forward and backwards. It's just quite amazing. So I did write some reviews of Colin Burrow's book and Jonathan Bate's book that are also published. I just included that there. And I'm going to exit this now.